I'll be the moderator of today's session, where we'll be discussing our latest report on escalating jihadist violence in Benin, Niger, and Nigeria border triangle. Over the past year, the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, also called JNIM, and the Islamic State Sahel Province, also called ISSP, have expanded their violent campaigns in the Benin, Niger, Nigeria borderlands. Accurate data indicates that this expansion has entered a new phase, marked by entrenchment and the transformation of littoral border regions into a flashpoint of violence. These developments are unfolding amid geopolitical shifts, weakened regional cooperation, and limited border security coordination. So, building on our last report by ACLED's West Africa senior analyst, Henny Ensibia, titled New Frontlines, Jihadist Expansion Reshaping Benin, Niger, and Nigeria Borderlands, today's discussion will explore how armed groups are adapting, interacting, and entrenching themselves across this volatile tri-border region. Our speakers for today's webinar, we have Henny Ensibia, who, like I've said, is ACLED's West Africa senior analyst and the author of the recent report that has inspired today's discussion. His research focuses on conflict dynamics and the evolution of militant Islamist groups across the Sahel and coastal West Africa. Today, Henny will help us unpack how groups such as JNIM and ISSP are adapting their strategies and entrenching themselves across the tri-border region. We also have Abiodun Jamiu, who is a Nigerian journalist with Deutsche Welle, whose reporting covers security, conflict, and governance issues across West Africa. While drawing from his on-the-ground and journalistic perspective, and Abiodun will reflect on how these evolving security dynamics are experienced locally and how they are reshaping communities and state responses in affected border regions. And finally, we have James Barnett. He's a Nigeria specialist with extensive experience analyzing armed groups and political violence in the Lake Chad Basin and northwestern Nigeria. In this conversation, James will provide insight into how developments in Nigeria's border regions intersect with wider regional insecurity trends and what the implications for global and especially US foreign policy are, particularly after the recent American airstrikes targeting ISSP in northwestern Nigeria. For the webinar today, we will have Henny give us a brief overview of his report, and then after that, our speakers will all answer questions that will set the ball rolling for the conversation today. Henny, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. First, I want to thank my colleague and our moderator, Miriam Ada, for managing today's discussion, but also my co-panelists, James Barnett and Abiodun Jamiu, that will contribute their expertise on a very relevant and timely topic, considering the rapidly evolving situation in the Benin, Niger, and Nigeria borderlands. It's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and I will begin by providing an overview of the key findings of our latest report before we kind of move into the weeds of the discussion around several key questions guiding this webinar. So building on our earlier report from March last year, over the past year, we have observed that it is no longer just geographic expansion. Rather, conflict dynamics have taken on new characteristics and proportions. The Al-Qaeda-affiliated Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin and the Islamic State Sahel province have entrenched themselves in this border triangle. 2025 marks a clear change from spread to sustained presence, and what more resembles consolidation and continued expansion. And as a result, the border triangle is rapidly transforming into a full-fledged conflict zone, rather than just being subjected to spillover from the central Sahel. Militant groups are taking advantage of long-standing vulnerabilities, exploiting governance gaps and weak regional military coordination. And this comes against the backdrop of geopolitical changes, political tensions between countries in the region, and with observable consequences like reduced cross-border cooperation. And most importantly, the situation is evolving faster than the states concerned are able to adapt the responses. The scale of change also becomes even clearer when we look at the actual numbers or statistics. From 2024 to 2025, violent events rose by 79% across the borderlands. Even more concerning, reported fatalities increased by 243%, meaning that the lethality is rising faster than activity. And as shown on the graph, you can see that there is really a sharp spike from the previous year or from 2024 until 2025. And even now, early in 2026, we have seen large-scale killings taking place in north central Nigeria and other events that contribute to this sharp increase of violence. Therefore, 2025 represents a sharp escalation and not just a continuation of the gradual increase that we have seen in the past few years. So it's clearly a very escalating trajectory. At the same time, both groups, when speaking about JNIM and ISSP, they have adjusted their communication strategy. They are now openly claiming attacks to assert territorial presence and publicize their footprint, including operations in areas where their activity was previously suspected, but now publicly broadcasted. And this escalation reflects more than simple rivalry. It suggests competition and seemingly a deliberate attempt to destabilize this border area to also consolidate control, especially in rural border areas that in the mid and long term could result in mounting pressure on population centers. Next slide, please. And geography, I would say, is central to understanding how this expansion is being sustained. Violence is heavily concentrated around the W. Arli Penjari or the WAP complex and surrounding borderlands. The use of forest reserves and protected areas is not coincidental, but has become an integrated element of militant strategy. They serve as transit routes, base areas, and staging grounds in order to conduct attacks. But they also enable mobility across borders while limiting state access. So at the same time, limited state presence and weak cross-border coordination create permissive conditions across vast rural spaces. And this is also reflected in the human geography because recruitment patterns really reflect this more embedded presence, with militant recruitment now evolving from earlier localized mobilization tied to farmer and herder conflicts to currently span diverse communities across the borderlands. And this also reflects trends that we have seen elsewhere in the central Sahel, where groups like JNIM and ISSP have broadened the recruitment to encompass a wider set of ethnic groups and various identity groups and groups with different livelihoods and linguistic identities. In addition, economic dynamics reinforce this presence. Control over smuggling routes, river transport, and local commerce ties local livelihoods to militant networks, particularly fuel trafficking, routes linking Nigeria, Niger, and Benin, which also creates both dependency and protection arrangements that deepen militant entrenchment in local economies. Next slide, please. And in this context, I also believe it's important to understand the relationship between Sahelian and Nigerian jihadi groups and how they interact. Their ties are not entirely new, but they are seemingly solidifying in practice. And groups often operate independently, but they may coordinate selectively in areas where they are active side by side. We see this most clearly in parts of Kwara State and around Kanji Lake in Nigeria, where activity involving JNIM, the Mahmouda group, and JAS, which is a faction of Boko Haram, overlaps geographically. And here we also come back to strategic communications, since so far it's only the Sahelian groups that publicly or officially have claimed operations, but these groups, they also communicate directly to communities. And this has been the case of Boko Haram or JAS, who has sent letters to local communities trying to extort them, but also request that they are allowed to go into villages and preach, and following villagers or residents, including village leaders, informing security agencies, this has triggered some of the large-scale killings we have seen in the past few months, or in the past month even. Another aspect is attribution, and I think what is particularly relevant for this topic is the ongoing debate surrounding the Lakurawa. And there are conflicting narratives in the media about the so-called Lakurawa, and this is a debate I hope we will be able to provide some clarity on in this webinar. And this is also a type of ambiguity over different groups, areas of operations, which really complicates security responses, but it can also obscure the true landscape of territorial influence. But in the aggregate, the patterns highlighted in this overview of the report point to a conflict environment that is increasingly interconnected and also rapidly evolving, but in particular, what appears to be a solidifying intersection between the Sahelian and the Nigerian conflict theaters and coastal West Africa more broadly. Still, I would say there are gray zones that really have to be disentangled because there's a lot of murkiness, and that's why we also are brought some of our colleagues, including James and Abiodun, to kind of try and shed light on this gap that exists between the Sahel and coastal West Africa and Nigeria in particular. And with that, I'm handing back to Miriam.
Thank you so much, Henny. That was quite an extensive overview. Thank you for all the salient points that you've pointed out. Before we delve into the dynamics on the ground, I would like to hear from James. Could you give us your perspective on the responses on external responses, particularly considering the airstrikes of December 2025 in northwest Nigeria and in Kwara State? So from your point of view, James, how does the recent US airstrikes in Nigeria connect to this growing jihadist threat?
Yeah, thank you very much, Miriam, for the question, for moderating. Thank you, Henny, for your really great work on these issues, and Abiodun for joining us as well, and for your excellent reporting. I think there's a lot to say about the U.S. policy in Nigeria right now and how much has changed just in the past 4 months, essentially. I think you can't understand the Christmas Day airstrikes in Sokoto State without kind of looking at the broader political context and what I would say is the political pressure that the U.S. put the Nigerian government under, specifically to stop the killing of Christians in Nigeria. Although, of course, the insecurity in the country is quite complex. You know, different groups target different communities. Muslims and Christians alike have been victims, but for various kind of political reasons and stuff, it's the violence against Christians that has, and particularly violence against Christians in the Middle Belt, that has attracted the most kind of U.S. attention. And so that put the Nigerian government in a very difficult spot. And I think that two things are true about the U.S., or I think two things can be true about the U.S. airstrikes on Christmas Day. The first is that I don't believe that the Nigerian government really requested those strikes, which is the official narrative, that they came out after the strikes, which were very unexpected, and then said, oh, yes, you know, these were done in coordination with the Nigerians and at our request. I think that politically, this was something that the Trump administration kind of foisted on Nigeria as essentially, this is, you know, as there were these discussions going on about security cooperation, this was America's, you know, the administration's way of also saying, you know, that President Trump kind of needs a domestic political angle to this, right? And so there wasn't actually a very clear military rationale for those airstrikes because, you know, the Nigerian military had already actually been conducting bombings in these areas for a while. Tomahawk cruise missiles, very destructive elements, very destructive weapons, but it's not really what you typically associate with striking militant camps. So I think that the Nigerian government was kind of forced into this position of accepting these strikes publicly, or else losing face politically, which could cause a lot of serious problems at home and these debates over sovereignty and everything. I think the other element, though, is that, and here I'm not entirely sure, you know, the exact details of this. I want to be clear about that. But I don't think the targeting of, you know, the group that was targeted and the location of the strikes was entirely accidental either. And I do think that in that regard, you know, the Nigerians and the Americans had been conducting, it seems like, joint surveillance around northwestern Nigeria for a while. And the Nigerians had been very concerned about the expansion of jihadist groups into Western Nigeria via both Niger and Benin, as well as the expansion of jihadist groups from northeastern Nigeria into parts of central and northwestern Nigeria. So in some ways, while we might have expected that the strikes would make more sense in the northeast because that's where ISWAP and JAS have their main bases. If you've been following these trends closely and if you're kind of aware of some of the Nigerian concerns, it wasn't too surprising that if they were forced to accept some sort of U.S. military action, that they would have kind of tried to channel that into northwestern Nigeria, and particularly targeting some of these groups that are encroaching from the Sahel. There was a lot of confusion, I think, among Nigerians and even among many non-Nigerian observers after the strikes, particularly with the framing around these strikes targeted the Islamic State. And that's because, as I think we'll probably discuss later, in the Nigerian discourse, what people talk about is the so-called Lakurawa, these jihadist militants from the Sahel, whose affiliation is very much debated among analysts, and I think reasonable people can disagree there. And I think in this regard that this was partially a failure of Nigerian strategic communications over the past really couple of years, because a lot of people saw this and said, well, there's Lakurawa in this area, so maybe the Nigerians were kind of essentially trying to play to Trump's, anti-ISIS kind of frame of reference by linking this group to ISIS when there's not actually any link there. But what I can say is that the Nigerian government, both publicly as far back as I think October, November 2024, but also, senior security officials in my own kind of field work and interviews have been very clear over the past, really for a year prior to the Trump kind of intervention, if you will, that they see Lakurawa, particularly in Sokoto State, as being linked to the Islamic State Sahel province. That doesn't mean that we should necessarily take their word at it. I've not always gotten as much details in my research as I might like. But I do think that this kind of reflects the fact that the Nigerians have been concerned specifically about an IS Sahel threat in northwestern Nigeria and potentially linking up with ISWAP in particular. But for various reasons, including the contentious kind of nature of Trump's commentary on Nigeria, if you will, there's been a lot of kind of political debate and confusion around this operation that now extends into the growing U.S. Military footprint in Nigeria.
Thank you so much, James. One thing that your presentation has just made clear again is that discussing political violence within this region is a very complex topic because, I don't think that 1 hour would be exhaustive enough to clarify all of these points. And I think it also means that at ACLED, we probably need to find some government official one day to come and answer this because we probably will never know what happened in that boardroom, I guess, and we'll never know why the decisions that were made were taken. So fingers crossed, hopefully one day someone accepts our invitation. Okay. For a more localized perspective on the situation, we would like to hear from Jamiu, who is a journalist and who works in the region and understands the local impact of the conflict. And considering the complications around ISSP and Lakurawa and other armed groups around, the northwest of Nigeria and even the tri-border region, in your opinion, Jamiu, how does the Sahelian and Nigerian jihadist groups interact across the tri-border areas, and why does it matter for how we understand the evolving threat landscape of the region?
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks to Eni for the fantastic overview, and James for providing the groundwork on the U.S. foreign policies and Nigerian security situation. In the region, particularly at the moment, the northwest and by extension, the north central region, as for now, been experiencing a couple of seismic shifts in the conflicts and the security dynamics in northwest and north central, where we have Sahelian militants, by extension Lakurawa, and a couple of other local homegrown jihadist group interacting at various intervals to actually push forward their expansions towards the south. What's particularly more disappointing or very much important to note is the fact that at the end of this, it's particularly the local community in those areas that are continuing to bear the brunt of the situation. For instance, the Lakurawa terror group have continually continued to wreckage to communities in Sokoto, in the Kebbi State, along the border with Benin Republic. But this cannot be done without local covers, without having some kind of relationship or collaboration with local jihadist group like Jazz, local bandits and others, terror group in the region. We've seen, for instance, the recent abduction of schoolgirls, of school kids in Papiri, and how a couple of the students were transferred to Alakoawa camp before they were eventually, ransom was paid and rescued by the Nigerian government. So all of these things says a lot to how collaborations and interaction between jihadists and Thailand group actually work. But what is even much more important to notice is that this cannot happen without the chronic underdevelopment in across the northernmost parts of Nigeria and by extension coastal West Africa. And in Niger State, we've seen cases where the Bermuda group had a couple of relation with a small cell of Jenim operating in that axis. We cannot particularly say that Jenim had a very big presence in that area, but with the attack that Jenim recorded in Noko, attacking a small group of military station in that axis, also show the extent to which the Mahmuda group and Jenim were also in some extent having a kind of collaboration, or Mahmuda allowing Jenim to use its area to actually carry out attacks in those axes. But the implication of all of these things is the fact that we'll be having a very devastating effect in those axes, the Benin, Nigeria, and the Niger axis, because when this group are allowed to fester, when the violence are allowed to fester over years, in fact, the Nigerian political heartland in Abuja, and also coming down here to southern part of the country, and also puts Nigeria, the Lagos state, at imminent risk, because at the end of the day, it's all puts the axis of influence around that area, the Kanji Lake and other forested area in the axis also serve as a very fertile ground for this guy to percolate and move abroad, move around. So in the border, that means that if the conflict or the interaction between this group continue, we'll be having a very difficult, a similar incidence of what is happening in the WAP region between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali in the Benin Nigeria tripod. So whatever the Nigerian government is do, the response has been largely reactive, not really consistent in the sense of how we have been trying to. The policy have not been able to keep up with the optics and violence. So in overall, what we are experiencing in Nigeria, Benin, and the Niger tripod is actually very devastating, given the uptick in the violence, particularly by bilateral group and other Sahelian militants in that area.
Thank you so much, Abiodun. And it is apparent that the West Africa region is becoming a melting pot, or has become a melting pot, for different armed groups and violent extremists, which is what Henny will be looking at in a bit. So I'd like to know from you, Henny, considering the situation currently and also the geopolitical situation in the region, considering the relations between Nigeria and Niger and even the AES countries, what do you see as what does this mean for the future trajectory of the region, and even including the armed groups operating in the region?
Yeah, to begin with, what we've seen since the breakup within ECOWAS is that there's been bilateral political tensions between former members and current members. That is notably between Niger and Nigeria on one hand, and on the other hand, between Niger and Benin. And I think this has played out in the latest coup attempt that took place in Benin, with accusations against AES countries for alleged involvement. But this is also something we have really seen in these border areas, or been able to observe through the very kind of limited cooperation at the military level, or in terms of security between these countries. And as long as they don't come to term and can reset these relationships to coordinate and cooperate. Yeah, there is still informal exchanges and intelligence sharing and so forth, but there is no like official or formal collaboration that is effective in the way that it prevents movements across the border. And I think that is quite clear in how we see that these groups operate. And adding to that, the fact that they are increasingly claiming operations, yeah, sometimes they use claims strategically to, portray a sort of expansion, but we are not really in this phase at this point because we have seen this going on for several years now. It began in earnest in 2021 in Benin after the initial spillover, and similarly in the past 2 years we have seen it across the Doso region and also in northwest Nigeria, and more recently in the north central. So this combined kind of indicate that these groups, they have an intent to stay there. They are entrenching themselves. Their presence is not just temporary, but instead they are confident enough to really broadcast their presence. And this is also the case of ISSP, because that is a much more recent development that wasn't highlighted in the previous report. So it's since December last year when they began claiming operations that really strokes the border from southern Tawa all the way down to Gobey in the Diondio commune in the Doso region. And this really shows that they are marking their footprint in areas where activities previously have been attributed to the so-called Lakurawa. But, not to get too deep into this debate of conflicting narratives, but at least through my research, I have come to the conclusion. I also followed this since the emergence and the first kind of infiltrations of Sokoto back in late 2018 and early 2019, where the group under the Islamic State West Africa province also claimed its first operations in Sokoto, and especially in particular in the town of Balle. And this is also somewhat lost in translation, this kind of the trajectory of the group and how they, from the initial, publication of their presence in Sokoto, went covert and continued their infiltration, built networks, and sustained, relations with local communities and so forth. And also to know that ISSP in particular, many of their members come from northern Tillaberi, and they also hail, maybe not first generation, but they have very strong kinship ties in the Nigeria borderlands. So that is also kind of important to underscore. And while the group has failed in their previous expansion efforts, let's say in southern Algeria, momentarily there was a stint in Benin in 2022, but that was through some infiltration of existing Jainim fighters in the area. However, ever since they went completely silent and since a recent defection, more information has come into limelight that Jainim very proactively is preventing ISSP to re-enter Benin. So, I mean, they have a very entrenched presence, and considering the escalating trajectory of violence, but also that we see signs of militiafication. So this is one of the questions I saw in the chat. But we also see signs of that. The communities are taking up arms in these areas where there is a very kind of weak military and security presence. I can let the other panelists speak about the Nigerian side, but in particular in Doso, we see an ongoing militiafication. And these groups are also responding to that. It has been very pronounced in the Tanda commune, in the Gaia department, but also in other parts of southern and eastern Doso. So I think these groups are here to stay, and they will continue leveraging, these vulnerabilities that exist, but also this limited military cooperation between states that, for various geopolitical reasons, don't really get along.
Thank you, Henny. That was very expansive. But before I let you off, I have two questions that I think we can take as one for you to respond to. It's about the situation in the West Africa region, going away from just the tri-border areas. So the first question is, what are the spillover effects of these dynamics in other regional countries such as Togo? And then we have another question is asking about the situation in Ghana. And it says, why haven't we seen any incidents happening within the territory of Ghana? And even if we know that the JNIM Katiba Banfora is involved in the cattle trade and most likely extracting revenue from markets in the north of Ghana. I think we can take those as one question.
Yeah, so in the case of Ghana, I think there has been a lot of debate why JNIM in particular doesn't attack Ghana. They benefit from supply routes, using Ghanaian territory for recruitment as a resting area, and this is also quite well documented. But it's really in the northernmost border zones, in border villages in particular. And the group has also been very explicit about it, that they don't actually combat states that doesn't proactively pursue them or fight them militarily. And I think this also has been manifested in the Ghanaian case, that there hasn't been many significant military operations driven by counterinsurgency efforts. Instead, focus have been on the Baku conflict in the far north, and this has somewhat taken precedent over the threat or potential threat from JNIM. So they really benefit from using some of these border areas, for supplies and recruits and movements, but also to kind of be able to stage operations, and especially in neighboring Burkina Faso. But we have also seen recently that the Burkinabe and Ghanaian authorities have reached some agreements to kind of try to unify their efforts or cooperate more closely. But even back a few years ago, there were operations that took place. These were almost like false flags, false flag operations, because they were reported as militant attacks, but they targeted village chiefs and some local communities in areas that weren't really affected by the insurgency at the moment. But these were Burkinabe forces that conducted covert operations very close to the border with Ghana. And I heard from security officials that said things are moving very slow on the Ghanaian side, so we had to take precautions and respond to what we saw emerging in those specific areas. It wasn't inside of Ghana, but also there has been non-violent incidents in Ghana. So, for instance, in the summer of 2022, some JNIM fighters, they pursued a VDP that has crossed the border in the area of Sapeliga, or at the market in Sapeliga, and it created panic among people present at the market, but also immigration officers. This is often very not widely mentioned or widely known, but these are like more low-key activities that have been observed inside Ghana. But still, they have treaded a quite fine line to not become dragged into the conflict themselves, and so far it has held, even though there was a time when some JNIM fighters called for the expansion of jihad into Ghana, because some people that have been displaced from Burkina Faso were they were sent back to Burkina and so forth, and some JNIM fighters responded to that pressure against the Fulani community in particular, and asked that the leadership give green light to expand jihad into Ghana, but it was not something that ever manifested, and the situation also kind of calmed down in the wake of those claims.
Right. Thank you, Henny. Abiodun, I have one question for you. It's what would you attribute for the spike in kidnappings and violent attacks spreading towards the southwest direction in Nigeria?
Thank you. I think we also need to understand the hybrid nature of Lakurawa and the fact that kidnapping for ransom has for many years served as a revenue stream for some of these terror groups, including bandits in northwestern Nigeria. So it is no saying that At the same time, it's also served as it's also revenue for the terror groups, the silent terror groups, and the Lakurawa, including other armed groups in that region, to engage in kidnapping for ransom. Because obviously, when kidnapping happens, there is no way local communities or relatives, one way or the other, find this means to actually pay this ransom and gain their loved one. It is better to have their loved one than to say the loved one is dead because they could not raise the money. And in recent instances, we have seen cases where people even crowdfund for ransom to secure the freedom or release of their loved one. But all this boils down to jihadists, armed groups, understanding the psychological trauma on families, while at the same time, seeing it as a sustained, source of revenue for them.
Right. Thank you so much. James, I have one question for you here, and it says the insecurity trend in the Lake Chad Basin is increasingly regional. While Boko Haram and ISWAP remain primary threats directly affecting northern Cameroon, do you think that the broader expansion of JNIM in the Sahel contributes to a widening arc of instability that could influence cross-border security dynamics over time? That's a very long question.
No, it's an important question. And actually, this would be a good chance, Miriam. Would it be possible to go to the slide? It's the map that my colleagues and I made for a study that was published in December 2025, looking at northwestern Nigeria. So the answer is, like, it kind of all depends on how you define arc of instability. I think that there already is an arc of instability insofar as if we look at the Lake Chad Basin countries and then we look at the Sahel countries and increasingly parts of the coastal countries in West Africa, they're all facing some form of kind of jihadist insurgency from one group or another to different extents. What I don't foresee happening in kind of the immediate future, at least, or the near to medium term, is the establishment of kind of a really expansive, contiguous jihadist kind of area of control, or even kind of across, say, the Nigeria-Niger border that would link northeastern Nigeria to northwestern Nigeria, and that's where kind of this map comes in. I think that one of the main reasons for that, obviously, there's the government responses and stuff, and as Henny alluded to earlier, the Nigerian and Nigerian cross-border cooperation is not as good as it previously was. Although I think there is some tactical cooperation, it's not where it needs to be. But I think the other factor here that's often overlooked is the sheer number of armed groups and the complexity of the relationships between those armed groups. So if we're looking at jihadist groups operating in Nigeria, we're looking at minimum at 5 groups, 3 Nigerian and 2 foreign, right? We're looking at ISWAP and JAS, and then Ansaru, and then Islamic State Sahel Province and JNIM now, it seems. Personally, I don't know, for example, if we can really treat Ansaru as a single coherent entity. There's a lot of ambiguity around it. You essentially have 3 different kind of insurgencies or networks that have been linked to Ansaru in different parts of the country. Like, for example, the Mahmouda group, we're not entirely sure, or at least I'm still not entirely sure of the relationship with Ansaru there. So, the jihadist landscape itself is already quite fragmented. But then the broader problem, as I see it in northwestern and many parts of north central Nigeria, which Abiodun in particular has alluded to, is this kind of crisis of banditry, which is highly fragmented. We're talking about dozens, depending on how you define it, and they're very loosely organized groups. But we're talking about, probably upwards of 100 groups with these kind of, some of these very deadly, powerful kingpins or warlords that control them. And in contrast to the dynamics in the Sahel, where I think over time, JNIM and IS Sahel have both become pretty effective at co-opting the local bandit networks and just essentially bringing them into the jihadist fold. In Nigeria, jihadists have been trying that for, depending on how you look at it, a decade, but certainly over the past 6 years, in the time I've been in Nigeria working on this issue. And they've probably seen more failure than success, although there have been some successes. There is cooperation between bandits and jihadists. But partially it's kind of, it boils down to the fact that the bandits themselves are already very powerful. In many ways, they're profiting from the status quo. They have very different kind of interests and grievances from the jihadists. They draw from a different social base for the most part, particularly as against the Nigerian jihadists. So even, one of the things we argued in our previous study was that the the kind of concentration of bandits, particularly powerful bandits in certain areas like Zamfara, parts of Eastern Sokoto, Western Katsina, have actually kind of caused friction with jihadists in the past and made it more difficult for jihadists to operate there, which I think is one reason why actually the Benin Niger border region is perhaps more attractive beyond, I mean, there are many benefits there. There are many reasons for this, including the terrain, including obviously the cross-border dynamics, but I think part of it too has to deal with the local dynamics of banditry. So all kind of a complicated way of saying, when you look at the fragmentation among the jihadists and then you look at all the other armed groups who are in the area, I don't kind of foresee, say ISWAP or JNIM kind of, controlling the Nigeria-Niger border in totality. But what I do worry about, and in particular along that border, is ISWAP and ISSP increasing coordination, because you don't actually need a contiguous jihadist territorial presence. We saw that with the attack in Niamey, where, just being able to send some ISWAP trainers, so long as they can kind of maintain a logistical route, you can transfer individuals, you can transfer equipment. And so that's really what worries me, I think.
Right. Thank you, James. I'm going to piggyback on what you've said and then your initial comments, and I'll be asking this question. Do you see any role of external actors to improve or stabilize the situation? And what kind of support would be requested, political, security, social, or economic?
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. It's very tricky. For a whole host of reasons, I'm not really optimistic about, for example, the US military kind of role in Nigeria that seems to be emerging. I try to remain optimistic. I think that, if everything goes really well and both the Nigerians and the Americans are very careful handling not only the operational components, but also the political components, the messaging, there are potentially some capabilities that, certainly the US military should not be underestimated, and there are capabilities that the Nigerians have asked for in the past. But I kind of foresee all these new problems emerging from it. And I also don't think that the US footprint, for example, is really a game changer. So maybe you get some tactical and operational improvements here and there, but it's not going to address the fundamental security crisis. And as we've learned, looking at the external interventions in the Sahel over the past 10, 15 years, what have you, even when there's kind of much more robust external intervention, it doesn't, Barkhane, Serval, all this stuff certainly did not kind of eliminate the problem. And it also brings with it lots of political issues and political challenges and political problems. So I think that, and I don't know if the political climate is even there in terms of the West, or Russia is not going to kind of deploy massive forces to the region. I think probably what we're seeing is more of going to be a mixture of kind of ad hoc regional coalitions, and then increasingly the role of private military contractors, which we're already seeing in some places, and not just the Russians, I think South African companies, potentially down the line, we might see American companies, and then, other countries like Turkey, for example, which has provided drones and military equipment, and according to some reports, private military contractors. So I think in terms of the external assistance, it's going to be quite patchwork. The geopolitical dimensions are going to influence that, right? Because of this ECOWAS, AES division, that you're not going to have kind of a coherent external or regional force forming to address this. What impacts that'll have, I don't know. I think it'll be area by area. In some arenas, maybe in the areas where the problem is still in the early stages, some of these efforts might be effective. But we've also seen, like, the work of Africa Corps, right? They're even on the metrics that I think the juntas are looking to judge them on. These groups can often be counterproductive because they can end up being so violent and indiscriminate. In some of these other countries, I think the PMCs might have much more limited roles to say, guarding infrastructure, mineral interests, stuff like that. So they're not really going to be going out there and proactively addressing the insecurity. So on the whole, no, I'm not super optimistic about this regional picture, but I do think we need to try and think about, what some of the least bad options would be given the current realities.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, James. There's an interesting question here on the responses of local communities. Henny's report already does some justice to that, but I would still like, because I've seen many questions in the chat box referring to the same point. So for that reason, I would like Henny to respond to the question or the ones that are related to it. It says, what are the responses of local communities in the northern areas? Example of Benin, in terms of cooperation out of necessity, or are there approaches that have worked to enhance resilience?
So it's quite mixed, I would say, in northern Benin. But what we've seen that, especially JNIM, they have broadened not only recruitment, but there is more kind of passive support, both passive and active. But this also relates to another question related to illicit trade. So fuel is a primary commodity smuggled from Nigeria across the border zone between Benin and Niger. And that fuel is often destined to areas where communities or even JNIM is the end user. So you have the route that goes to Falmey in Dosso, into Sai and Torodi in southwestern Tilaberi. But similarly, you have another route that goes across the Niger River and via Mekru into eastern Burkina Faso. And we all know that eastern Burkina Faso is under strong JNIM influence, where the state's presence is limited basically to major towns or departmental capitals, where there's still VDP or Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland in some villages. So I would say that fuel is a key commodity, and also local markets. So we see that local communities cater more and more to these groups, and this is also reflected in the arrests of people and traders in local markets in northern Benin, and especially in the northern parts of Alibori. So that is also an area where JNIM really has asserted their influence, especially in the commune of Karimama, where they participate in Friday prayers. They go in and out of villages pretty much as they like, and then withdraw to Park W or cross the river into Niger. So they enjoy a lot of freedom of movement in these areas. And over time, due to the sustained presence, more and more local residents have been involved, or yeah, even their livelihoods have been increasingly tied to militant activities.
Right. I'd like to state that for want of time, we will not be able to take all the questions that we have, but our panelists will be responding to as many questions as are left behind via email. So you will be getting an email with responses to the questions that are not answered here, while we also have analysis pieces that answer many of the other questions here. So I would like to also encourage you to go on our website and look through our analysis pieces and other webinars that we've had previously. Abiodun, I have one question here for you. It's closely related to the question on the kidnappings in the southwest, or the surge of kidnappings in the southwest of Nigeria. It says that Nigeria has just launched Operation Savannah Shield on the side of the border in northern Kwara. What do you make of its chances of slowing down the violence?
Nigeria, floating the Operation Savannah Shield is commendable, given the swiftness of the formation of the military of the shield. But nevertheless, we also should understand the fact that Nigerians over the years, our counterterrorism operation or response has been largely reactive. What happened in Kwara was just a response to what happened in Kwara. The same way we've had situation where communities in the northwest and the north central, because these conflicts are not different. They as well share some kind of similarity, but at the same time, government response has been the same over the years. Has been largely reactive, responding to crisis. For instance, you may have in communities in Sokoto, in Kebbi, you have large stretch of land or communities that are completely detached from state presence. Do not even have security posts to begin with. So how do you reactively or effectively respond to security situation in those access? How do you go into this community when you're dealing with armed group that is very depth in asymmetrical warfare? So these are some of the issues. So coming up with the community, with the military formation, is still the same thing, reactive of what happened in Kwara. But what we'll be saying is, if the Nigerian government could sustain the response, could take the fight to where it is, not just stay away, far away, 150 kilometers from where it is, where the main situation is happening, then we might have something positive to say. But otherwise, I am not optimistic of anything about what, because we've seen exactly the same situation in the Northwest when Operation Yamafasa was floated in the Northwest. We're seeing how it has been, when the same issue was also floated in a part of Kebbi. But almost all of these things are largely reactive. They are not consistent. We've seen cases where communities will reach out to security operative, but look at the case of Kwara. These guys operated for closely 10 hours before the security operative could come there. And it's exactly the same thing that has been happening in the Northwest for years, because it is now closer to our people in the Southwest, closer to the political outlet. We kind of try to say it as something, but it is not new. It is the same Nigerian government response to our security situation. But I'm kind of hopeful that with the whole pressure on the Nigerian government, they might probably want to do something or sustain the response or the offensive against these guys. Otherwise, we're just repeating, the same response over and over again.
Right. That's a lot to unpack, I must say. Thank you so much. Last question for Henny, and it's asking if there are any links between the groups we have mentioned today and other jihadist groups across the wider African region.
Yeah, so in the case of Al-Qaeda affiliates, we know that there are communications. They share channels on Telegram, on WhatsApp, where fighters from JNM exchange with those from Al-Shabaab and even other areas outside of Africa. And this also kind of relates to some questions from the audience. That is quite important to also kind of understand, despite the uncertainty and the kind of gray zones that I mentioned in the overview, that JNIM and Ansaru, they have also kind of, in a way, strengthened their ties over the years. And there are many that even like local Nigerian experts that allude to, the presence of both JNIM and Ansaru in Kwara and Niger State, even though they're not always clear about how to even differentiate between JNIM and Ansaru, because JNIM has become the more dominant actor throughout the broader region and has the resources to kind of co-opt more local groups. And we also have the question of Mahmouda that comes back recurrently. And yeah, James can fill in on that, but there's also like a lot of debate about the Mahmouda group's actual affiliation with ties to all factions rooted in the Boko Haram insurgency. And in relation to ISWAP and ISSP, it's often forgotten that they were part of the same province for 3 long years. And, ISWAP advisors have been sent to the Sahel, even smaller groups of reinforcements. And this was also one of the reasons that local people say that the so-called Lakurawa was established as a form of coordination platform initially, even though it has become a much more Sahelian venture, so to speak. And for me, there is really no ambiguity. So no one can convince me that this is a distinct group, to be very frank and clear about this conversation. And like I said, more and more evidence shows that even ISSP, they want to show that their area of operation is the Niger-Nigeria border, even though they haven't announced again their presence on the Nigerian side, but these are really border localities that stroke the very area where activity is attributed to the so-called Lakurawa. But the initial Lakurawa, they were ISSP recruits back in 2018, 2019, and fighters coming from northern Tillaberi down to northwest Nigeria. However, it has become an all-catch term, more or less, to describe Sahelian militants, even though there is, potential overlap in parts of Kebbi State and so forth. But I leave it at that, and people, can try to, make their own judgment.
Thank you so much, Henny, and our other speakers. First of all, 1 hour would typically not be enough to exhaust this topic. And so we're very sorry for the questions that we have been unable to take. We promise to send out responses. And then to wrap up, I would like to give each of our speakers 1 minute each to say some final comments. And I'll be starting with Abiodun.
Okay, thank you. I lost my connection for a few seconds. I mean, the Nigerian factor. But nevertheless, yeah, the entire situation, especially in local communities, I mean, needs to be strengthened. The resilience of local community needs to be strengthened if we are going to, in any way, be in control of the situation, because as it is now, government policy do not match up with the uptick in the violence that we are experiencing at the moment. But I was having the conversation yesterday, and I felt like local communities, we cannot win this war against violence or extremists without strengthening our local community and without ensuring that there is a trust in the system. The military operation that was floated, the Savannah Shield, cannot operate in isolation. It has to be, in collaboration with local communities, because that's a chain of events. So my emphasis will just be strengthening community resilience and ensuring that we are able to rebuild trust with local communities. Because if we cannot rebuild trust with local community, we are indirectly pushing them away into the harm of these armed groups to either as victims or as collaborators. So yeah, that's will be my last comment. Strengthening local resilience and rebuilding trust with local communities.
Right. So let's have Henny next. Thank you so much, Abiodun.
So I will just add to Abiodun's comments that, as long as these conditions prevail, the issue will persist and also potentially grow. And this is the pattern that we have seen, in the past years, and even more pronounced in 2025 and in early 2026. So unless, local communities are providing, are provided enough safety and security, and borders play a quite central role into this due to militant mobility, since they can, conduct attacks on one side and then withdraw to the other, as we see, across this very sub-region. And, before local states or states in the region don't cooperate efficiently to kind of manage or mitigate this threat, I think the situation will only become more, aggravated.
Thank you so much, Henny. We'll have James comment next.
Thank you. Now the pressure is on, I feel like, as I'm the last one. Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting few months, to put it moderately, as an American researcher who's kind of been working in Nigeria for a while and based here for a while. I think I often try to think of kind of, if I had the ear of the senior Nigerian and American policymakers, what I would tell each of them. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily have the ear of either. But I think on the Nigerian side, because that's my focus is very Nigeria centric. A lot of it comes down to a question of political will. There are real challenges and capability challenges, resource challenges, different issues that have kind of impeded or complicated the Nigerian security force responses. Abiodun did an excellent job talking about how reactive it's been. But I think there's also just a ton of public distrust and suspicion. And so this whole spat with Trump and the US, I certainly don't agree with President Trump's kind of approach and framing, but you need to look beyond this you need to look beyond just the diplomatic angle, and also consider how the underlying insecurity is driving a crisis of confidence and legitimacy in the Nigerian state. And there are things that the government can do to try to earn back that trust. And then from the US side, I would just caution how complex this is. Nigeria is immensely complex in its own right. I'm pretty sure its population alone is bigger than all the other countries in the region combined, incredibly diverse, very fragile in some ways. And then obviously now this ties in with the regional threats as well. And so there needs to be you can't, I think, just treat this as a simple military problem of, oh, let's find the bad guys and try to kill them. even identifying who the bad guys are in Nigeria is so complex. And then you've got these broader local, national, and regional political dimensions. So, tread carefully and, try to think things through.
Thank you so much for the advice. And I think that it's time to petition the Nigerian government to give you a passport if you don't have one already.
One day,
Right.
hopefully.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate your presence. And I would like to also encourage you to go to our website and take a look at all other analysis pieces that we have out there, and also look forward to the ones that we have upcoming and check out our previous webinars as well. Thank you so much and see you next time. Bye.